Hi, this is Tim. On July 27th, Richard Thompson passed away. He was the creator of the comic strip Cul de Sac. He was suffering from Parkinson's disease, and he quit the strip 4 years ago. And at that time, Tom Spurgeon and I did an episode about Cul de Sac. And so this week, to remember Richard Thompson, we are representing that episode. It's Deconstructing Comics number 331 from September 17th, 2012. This is Tim.
And this is Tom.
And this is Deconstructing Comics. Welcome to Deconstructing Comics. This is Tim in Tokyo with Tom Spurgeon in New Mexico. Is that right?
That's right. I'm sitting here all alone in New Mexico.
Okay. And we decided to talk about Cul de Sac by Richard Thompson because it's about to end. September 23rd will be the last strip because Thompson's dealing with Parkinson's disease, and he's just not going to have the time to do the strip anymore, unfortunately. And now this has been going on for 5 years, the strip. And basically, well, it's the main, I guess you'd say the main two characters are Petey and Alice Otterloop. And we see their parents and other kids that they know. Although we don't really see other kids that Petey knows. I don't think he knows any other kids.
Well, we get Ernesto, his nemesis, who he thinks might be imaginary, or we think might be imaginary. And then there's the young girl that he has a crush on, whose name I can never remember, who calls him Petey Potterpoop.
Okay.
And I don't. So we do see a couple of the other kids, and then he goes. He's been in a cartooning camp a couple summers, and there are kids there.
Okay.
But talk about the origin of it. I think the origin of it is pretty great. If you don't mind me talking about this a little bit.
Sure, go ahead.
Because when Richard talked about conceiving of the strip, he actually told the story about Cul de Sac being kind of like the kind of neighborhood, or the kind of suburban neighborhood with kind of a dead end street with a bunch of houses that look the same. You would imagine. And the Washington, D.C. area in which Richard lives is kind of full of those neighborhoods, one of the first kind of areas, like where it kind of had those instant communities kind of spring up, where it's basically like a gas station and maybe a grocery store and then just winding suburban streets. Mm-hmm. But he told me that where he got the idea for to do a kids, he wanted to do a strip, but a kids strip, sounded like such a cliche. But when he was with his own kids, and was kind of wandering around the neighborhood, if I remember the story correctly, and I'm pretty sure I do, that his kids kind of pointed out that there were different places in the neighborhood that they had a different way of looking at the neighborhood than he did. Like, for instance, they knew the houses where you could get like water out of the side of the house, or where certain dogs were in the neighborhood. And he realized that he had like this completely different view of his neighborhood than his kids did, and they basically existed in two different realities. Mm-hmm. And so when he kind of put Alice and Petey together, even before I think their personalities really took hold, I think that he was kind of working with this idea that it would be kind of a kid's view of the world and an adult's view of the world, and not those two not really meeting up. Mm-hmm. And that was going to be the tension that would kind of move his strip forward. Mm-hmm. And I think that was kind of true, and you kind of see it further developed. Petey's kind of a classic nerd outsider kid, but even Alice, doesn't really kind of connect with her parents. Her dad, in particular, doesn't really understand what is going on in that kid's head. And I think a lot of parents feel that. I think it's a completely different world sometimes, and even though you might inhabit the same house and you might end up in the car together, it's not the realities never quite connect. Mm-hmm. So I think that's where he was kind of thinking when he kind of started doing the strip. And of course he had been doing a bunch of stuff before that. He was an older guy when he got the strip. So I don't know. I think that's, kind of where he was coming from initially.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well,
and so please go ahead.
I had hoped that I would be able to read the whole 5 years before we did this. I just read the first one, and then I've been reading it in the daily Go Comics emails for the past year or so.
Okay.
But the middle ones, I guess, I haven't seen much of. But I was struck, first of all, by how hilarious it was right out of the gate. I was expecting, well, 5 years is kind of short, but usually when you go back to see the early strips of any comic strip, the art looks different and it's not as funny, and the tropes that are developed later aren't there. But it seemed like he had a lot of that stuff fully formed or almost fully formed already. And
yeah, I think there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that he was an older guy, and I remember when he came out to San Diego Con as a guest of honor, or one of their special guests one year, a couple of the comics people that I knew that were interested in meeting him were kind of surprised that he was an older guy. They just figured that he was a guy like in his early 30s. But Richard was 50 the year the strip came out. I don't remember when during that year. So he'd already had a pretty long career. So he had the advantage that a lot of strips have that come out of the gate, where they have an older creator that can kind of get at it right away. But of course, he'd been working as an illustrator and a caricaturist for years. He'd been doing this thing for the Washington Post style section called Richard's Poor Almanac, which was kind of a catch-all local strip and kind of local culture strip. And in fact had been doing like these little kid, kind of proto Cul de Sac version for a good time before he got into Cul de Sac. But yeah, I had the same experience you did, which is I stumbled across the strip like 2 months in, and I've seen strips that came out of the gate that were really accomplished, that were really like you kind of were impressed by how they kind of nailed a certain rhythm right away, and not even strips that are my favorite strips, but like a strip. Zitz was a strip that kind of hit on all cylinders coming out of the gate, and is kind of like a model strip that a lot of cartoonists look at to see how you kind of hit those marks early on. But I don't think I've ever seen a combination of a strip that was that accomplished, that did everything you needed a strip to do in those first few months. But it was also just very funny and very genuine, and just kind of sustained that for about 5 or 6 months, where he was just slaughtering people just every day. Like 5 of the 7 strips were really good, and the other 2 weren't bad, and it was just, it came on really strong, really quickly. And I just think that he just was kind of ready, I think, to do a strip at that point. And I know everyone kind of knew about him. Everyone, and I remember something that syndicate people told me when he started to hit was, a couple of the syndicates that he didn't go with told me variations of the same thing, which was like, I didn't think that he had a strip in him at this point, or we would have been, like he was kind of like one of those, like one of those guys who is always, one of those guys that always looked to as a guy who might have done a strip. But I think a lot of people thought that if he was going to do one, it would have been before he was 50. So I think he was always well regarded. But yeah, man, he killed it right from the beginning. And and I don't know of a strip. Like I said, there's strips that are accomplished like Zitz, and there are strips that are funny right away. Like Doonesbury was pretty funny right away in the kid strip back in the student strips back in the 70s. And the Boondocks, I think, was actually very funny from the beginning, even though not as accomplished. But you're right that it's really pretty rare, and you really sometimes see those strips, and it doesn't have any relation to when it gets good, and they usually don't get good for about 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, well,
sure.
I kept in various ways, I kept comparing this to Peanuts as I was reading it. And Peanuts takes, really, to get to be the strip that we all know and love, it takes about 10 years at least.
Yeah.
And the art changes drastically even the first 5 years. But
and he does all sorts of, Schultz does all sorts of weird humor that you never saw again. There's a lot of really mean strips, and there's a lot of assertive Charlie Brown strips where he trashes something or yells at somebody, and you're like, whoa, Charlie Brown, calm down. Who is this young man disguised as Charlie Brown? So yeah, it took him 5 years to get close to the strip he was doing.
Yeah.
And the strip was at its best in the early 60s, I think people think, and that wasn't. Calvin and Hobbes, which is the strip that Cul de Sac gets compared to a lot, was really pretty good right from the beginning too. And so that's another way that those two strips kind of compare.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a rare thing.
One reason that I thought to compare Peanuts to this was that in both strips the kids have really large vocabularies, and they can talk in adult sounding ways, but the difference is, I think, the way that the kids think is very different, because the Peanuts kids seem to think like adults, but the Cul de Sac kids really think like kids. They just express themselves much more eruditely, I guess you could say, than real kids would. But their imaginations and everything, the way that they see things, is very childlike.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very astute observation, and I think that if you didn't, it is the vocabulary. I mean, Alice has an astounding vocabulary for a 4-year-old. And then Petey, even if he was as smart as the kid seems to be, would have it. But yeah, I mean, the psychological approach, or the way the kids view, like you said, the way the kids view the world, there was a strip that he did, and I think it was just last summer, where Petey was going to do a comic about Alice's end of the summer pageant. And one of the things that he was freaked out about, he had a lot of anxiety about, was he didn't want to sit in a crappy chair at the play that his kid's sister was going to put on. And that just seemed to me that just seemed like the kind of stupid thing that a kid would obsess over, that he didn't want. And when he got into his chair, he was delighted because there were fat people on either side of him and they couldn't see him, and it was not a ridiculous little chair in the back. So he was perfectly okay. But just Richard was very astute about, I think, has always been very astute about picking up on those kind of psychological constructs that kids kind of latch onto, or that kids are concerned about, or the way that kids react, even though it's expressed in these magnificent vocabularies that the kids have, and accomplished craft skills that the kids seem to display in the classroom. Yeah, no, I think that's a totally great observation, and I think that is a way that he breaks with Schultz. And Schultz's work is, I think, a lot more personal in that it screens a lot of his own thoughts and feelings about things, and is all the remarkable for it. But yeah, that's a way that Richards breaks a lot with this one.
You mentioned the craft skills. In that first year, there are some kids in the neighborhood who build a trebuchet.
Yeah.
A catapult. They catapulted some marshmallows somewhere.
Yeah, there's always the little bit of advanced work from the kids in the neighborhood. And I think he always had he was very judicious about the way he brought those kids on. The first thing I thought when I saw the strip, other than just kind of being blown away by it, was that I wondered if the cast was a little bit small, because you have these two kids and their family, and it didn't seem like if he was just going to stick with the family that it would have enough. It might get old after a while, because the kids kind of dominate over the parents too in terms of the focus he was given. And he was always very judicious, I thought, about bringing in those neighborhood kids to play off of Alice and Petey. And I always appreciated that, whether it was Bill and his brothers and whatever they were building at the time, or whatever Dill was fleeing from their plans. I always thought he did a pretty good job of a pretty stellar job of having a supporting cast that he didn't overexpose. Even like the guinea pig or the banjo man or the teacher, who are all these kind of oddball characters that you could have you could easily do a month with them. He was always pretty judicious. He was always very, very much of a mind of bringing them back, bringing things back around to the two main kids.
Yeah,
and I always thought that was
every once in a while.
Too.
Every once in a while, there's a punchline delivered by an adult, and it kind of always stands out for me, and it feels nice to have that variety once in a while, to have a punchline that's not delivered by a kid. So it's. I mean, I'm fine with the kids being funny, but every once in a while, it feels nice to have that a little bit different take. Or even, I think there was one where some bugs are talking to each other in the last panel.
For sure. For sure, yeah, and the mom kind of came into focus, I think, as the strip went along a little bit more than she was right at the beginning. And if I recall correctly, Richard kind of based that off his own mom, who was kind of one of those big, showy, loud mothers that everyone in the neighborhood both loved and kind of feared, and the kids were, continually, perpetually embarrassed by. So yeah, I think he did a nice job, and that's another way that the strip kind of works like Calvin and Hobbes, because Calvin and Hobbes would occasionally have mom or dad come in with a joke, and that would really kind of leaven or kind of give you a different perspective on that family unit than constant Calvin jokes. But you're right, I think. But he's always very judicious. He never really got burnt out, and I always thought that was going to be a big problem with that. I always thought the strip might become stifled in a way, that you might go to the PD well one too many times. But he was he did a really nice job, and it seems like it lasted a lot longer than its 5 years, but not in a bad way. It didn't seem like it certainly didn't overstay its welcome. I could have read that for several more years.
I noticed too some things about the way that he wrote it. I mean, there were a number of strips where it's not just a punchline at the end. Like, almost every panel is funny. There was a Sunday one just a couple months into the strip. It's the very first one where Petey makes a shoebox diorama. And it's the third Thanksgiving, by which time everyone's getting on each other's nerves, and it's just joke. I'm just cracking up.
Yeah, no, he does a very nice job. I mean, and I think a big advantage that he has with the way that he doesn't have to, kind of go to a punchline, is that he draws really well, and it always makes like every moment. His drawing isn't just the language. It isn't just there to kind of throw you to that last panel where there's a gag. Yeah, you can kind of linger. You can kind of hang out. You can kind of stick around with the characters. So he did a very nice job of he never fell into a rhythm. I don't think we can ascribe to him a specific kind of joke telling pattern. I think that strip is all the stronger for it.
There were some I noticed where, like the punchline, there would be kind of a standard joke, like, and then somebody else would throw in some other wacko extra punchline. There's this one that I found where Petey's gone into soccer. Not that he really wanted to, but and he's wondering if the shoes are going to help him or not. And Alice says, "Try them with another sport like paddleball." Oh, good idea. Twang, twang, twang. And then the last panel, Petey's saying they didn't help at all. He's got the paddleball string all tied around his head. Now, in a lot of strips, that would be the end. But then Dill, there also in the last panel, is saying, "I thought getting it wrapped around your head was the whole point of paddleball."
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, he's not, and he's not alone in doing that. The famous one for doing that is Trudeau again with Doonesbury. Was always kind of famous for those silent third panels and then joke in the fourth panel. But Richard was a lot looser, I think, with his jokes. And I think that, I noticed that when I was going back looking at strips that I liked for, writing the article about him quitting, was that I would remember panels, or that I would remember strips around the panel before the end of the panel. Like there's a strip early on where, which is one of those strips that, again, is kind of funny every panel, which is the father keeps on encountering Alice at different times of the day, and she's wearing a completely bizarre costume in every different panel, or is doing, like is pulling something along and he has no idea. And I always remembered that joke, I always remember that Sunday, and I remembered it for the dad saying, Alice and our lives intersect just enough to be surreal. But when I looked at it again, you're right. That wasn't the final punchline. The final punchline was Alice and Petey in Petey's room, and Alice saying something like along the lines of every time I turn around, there he is, and Petey saying if he would just work harder at his job, we could afford a bigger house and this wouldn't be a problem. which is a great little punchline at the end, but it's not what you remember the strip for. So he was very confident and very loose as far as the way his jokes were structured, for sure. I think I totally agree with you there, and I think that will be a big strength of the strip when we look back on it. When we look back on it in its entirety.
I think if I were doing a daily strip, I would be kind of afraid to put multiple jokes in one strip because I'd be using up all my jokes. But he just keeps finding more.
Yeah, I wondered about that early on when he was burnt out. And I think it's just he was just ready to do that, and he's really confident. And I think he had a established career. It's not like he was a broke 23-year-old that just out of college trying to turn his college strip into his first job. And I think that kind of let him play around a bit. I think that not only did that make him a little more confident on the page, but I think that it's not like this was his one shot. He had other gigs. He had good gigs. He was a very in fact, I'm not sure that he didn't take a pay cut to be a strip cartoonist. But I don't think the strip was ever syndicated in more than 250 papers or 250 clients, because they actually count dailies and Sundays separately. So it wasn't a very widely. It's really when you get up in the 400, 600 range that you start talking about it being a solid hit. So I just think he just didn't. I don't know. He was very fearless, though. You're right, and he was very not. It's almost like if it didn't work, if it didn't go down, it would. It's like he could just always go back to what he was doing, and what he was doing seemed to be very creatively satisfying. So yeah, good for him. That is a horrible gig for second guessing yourself, and especially before the internet. Classically, you never. When you do a strip, you know how many papers that you're in, or how many clients that you have. And he launched with 70, so that was a pretty good launch. After that, though, you really don't get much feedback. Early on, you might get 2 or 3 letters, but unless you break out like a Boondocks did, or a Doonesbury or a Calvin and Hobbes did right away, you're not going to hear back from people until you start to gain, momentum. So it's kind of like playing to an empty theater, and then at the end of the month you find out who dropped you and who picked you up. So it's a really tough gig. You can get into the habit of constantly second guessing yourself, of saying, am I doing, is this appealing, am I turning people off, what do I need to do to get more clients, should I, you're getting advice from people, like go with the guinea pig, So for him to be able to turn all of that off, just run this opening run of strips that was just really personal and funny and weird, and not really set to any rhythm, and not gag oriented, not featuring the uh-oh baby at every opportunity in order to drive licensing or whatever. That's really remarkable. That's quite the artistic accomplishment, I think, and I all respect to him for kind of doing it the way he wanted to do it, and his peers kind of, I think, sensed that, which is why he won the Reuben, or took home the Reuben last year. I think that was Bob Harvey pointed out that that's the second fastest that anyone has won the Reuben, as far as a strip being in the life of its syndication. I just think his peers kind of sensed that he was the real deal. And I think he was. I think Cul de Sac was. And Richard, whatever he does next, he will continue to be the real deal, of course.
Coming up, in the age of dying newspapers, is Cul de Sac the last great American newspaper strip? Also, Richard Thompson's horrible funny anecdote, and babies are creepy. If you're enjoying this podcast, help us spread the word through iTunes and social media, or just tell all your comics-loving friends. Give us a tweet or share an episode on Facebook, and join our Facebook group. Also, let us know what you'd like to hear on the show. Write to mail@deconstructingcomics.com. Now here's a message from a fellow member of the Comics Podcast Network at comicspodcasts.com.
Oh, okay. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to, Anyway, how's your streak? Want to do the intro today?
No.
Audio Shocker Podcast, Audio Shocker Podcast, Audio Shocker Podcast,
Audio Shocker Podcast.
A podcast with Ross and Nick.
Hey Neil, do you want to hear about this incest anime that we watched?
Not really. I mean, I think we should keep it mildly clean.
Are you serious?
Why?
Did you really just say that?
I said mildly clean.
Why?
Yeah, what's wrong with you? What did you do with Neil? Where is Neil?
He might be in a gutter somewhere.
It seemed like every time I read any article about Cul de Sac, it would be sort of bemoaning the fact that he didn't, that he appeared in an era when newspapers are kind of dying out and new comic strips don't get the exposure that they used to. And I think sometimes there's a little bit too much hand-wringing about that, because I guess there still are a lot of people who read newspapers, and there are a lot of us who read comic strips online. But
Right.
But I don't know. How much do you think that was a factor?
Well, it is a factor in some ways, and just the basic way that you just overall you just are having it's musical chairs. There are fewer slots for newspapers in which they can appear. Mm-hmm. One thing, there are hidden things too. Like one of the things that for a strip like Cul de Sac or any strip starting out, that used to be a very much an advantage was that most of the major cities used to be two newspaper cities. And so, like in Seattle, say, where they used to have the Post-Intelligencer and the Seattle Times, when a news strip came along that was good-looking like Cul de Sac, even if you didn't have a place for it, even if you didn't have a slot for it right away, someone would probably buy it to keep the other guy from getting it. And so when over the last 15 years, as all of these big towns went to one newspaper, there was even more of an effect of just dropping a page of newspapers. It dropped a whole page of newspapers from the paper that went out of business.
A whole page of comics.
Plus, a bunch of comics would go away. Excuse me, I'm not using the proper language. But all those comics would go away. But then you'd lose like the 10 or 15 comics that the newspapers might have been buying and not publishing just for a competitive advantage. So there are all these like weird kind of musical chair kind of things, and people, they're wanting to cut costs, so they want cheap strips. They don't want to irritate anyone into canceling their subscriptions, so they're very careful about putting stuff in. So it's it's rough for that market. It's as rough as that market's ever been. And of course, around 2008, about a year after Richard launched, it was Armageddon. That's when the free fall started happening for papers. People started panicking and people started freaking out. So the last thing that people wanted to do was to pick up new strips. So I think that for him to get to 250 in that market is a remarkable thing. You're right in that people make too much of a big deal of it, because if you can, there are still people that I would take there. It's still a really good gig if you can, especially if you can get in over 100 papers and start to build your client list. That is a good middle class cartooning gig, and it's not. And we should never sneeze at that. And you can't really compare it to what things are going to be like in the future, because that's still that's a job. That's a real good professional outlet, and you get books going, and you're not doing any more work for. When you get more clients, that's a good thing. I would take no one's going to turn down that kind of gig in this overall climate. It's still a good job. So I think people do make a little bit too much of it, but yeah, Richard had some very specific challenges, and his timing was about as bad as it comes. So I can understand when people say that. I know that people kind of wring their hands and it's the last great American newspaper strip, and I don't think that's true. And Doonesbury's still around, and you know, depending on how you measure greatness, you know, Beetle Bailey's been around for 60 years, and there are a lot big chunks of that which are good, and Mort's still hanging in there, and Mutts is awfully pretty. I don't know if there's ever been a strip as pretty as that one. You know, or
what?
There haven't been a lot of strips prettier than that one over the years, and I think it's a very funny strip.
What strip?
So, you know, people, Mutts, Patrick McDonald does.
Okay.
Yeah, which I think which I think people have cooled on, but I think that they will come back to. It's about 12 years in.
Mm-hmm.
So there are strips, and you know, someone's going to come along as long as there are newspapers, and who knows if there will be 10 years from now. I don't know. But right now, it's still a pretty good gig. I don't think, you know, none of those guys are really hating it yet. So you're right. It's a little bit. There probably is a little bit too much made about that.
Mm-hmm.
For sure.
Were you acquainted with him from the beginning? I mean, were you reading it from the beginning?
You know, I wanted to know that too, so I actually went back. I think I just stumbled across it like about 3 weeks in, just doing my stupid, you know, looking at stuff online for the website gig, and just kind of flipped out because I just remember thinking, like, what is this? Like, I couldn't believe how good it was when I read like a couple weeks of it. And I met him. He did. You know, he's one of those rare strip guys that actually did a couple of the shows. He did Heroes Con in Charlotte, and he did Small Press Expo (SPX) in Bethesda pretty regularly. So I got to meet and hang out with him there. And of course, he was a special guest at Comic-Con one year, like I mentioned earlier. So I've met him at these shows is all, and you know, we've corresponded and stuff. But I think I was just taken with it really early, and I got pretty obsessive over it. Sammy Harcum, the cartoonist, made fun of me about how much I was posting, like, hey, go look at this Cul de Sac. It's great. Like, every other day. It was like, oh, more Cul de Sac. And so I was really obsessed with it at first, but no, I just came at it to it as a fan. And the nice thing, of course, is that he's a super nice man. He's about as sweet and as nice and funny as you would hope for a guy like that to be. He seems like just a really good guy, and he has a super nice family too. Mm-hmm. So yeah, and more to the point, Tim, I think he's really liked that aspect of it, that he's kind of gotten to know other cartoonists, and he's gone to the shows, and you know, y'all go out to dinner afterwards, and you sit there and you talk with the guys across from you at the other table. I think he's really enjoyed that part of it, as sick and weird as that might sound. But I think he's actually enjoyed like meeting other cartoonists and getting that feedback from other cartoonists that were, you know, outside of his you know, direct peer group. And you know, I think that Ignatz, not the Ignatz, excuse me, that's the one coming up that he's going to get an award coming up at the Ignatz's next weekend. But he, the Reuben, the outstanding cartoonist of the year, which is a big honor. And I think that did mean quite a bit to him. I think kind of making all these friends has kind of meant a lot to him at this kind of professional point in his career. It's a lonely job, that cartooning, you know, especially that magazine cartooning and stuff that he was doing before. I just can't imagine. I imagine he knew a lot more editors than he knew cartoonists, and as we both know, editors are the worst people on earth. I wouldn't wish them on anyone. They are horrible. Oh my God. Poor Richard. And cartoonists, of course, are the second worst people on earth, but not as bad as editors. So, but no, I think he's like that. I think that's been really good for him, and I think he's genuinely enjoyed the notoriety within his field, you know, from his peers that doing a strip that's been so well received has brought him.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the baby before, and so there seemed to be a kind of recurring thing throughout the strip of like babies are creepy. Which I find kind of interesting, you know, because, you know, the kids themselves were babies not too long ago, but somehow babies scare them or something.
You know, and specifically this little baby that we'll call, you know, the baby that says uh-oh. And, you know, he actually did some, like, kind of grassroots licensing with the baby, so there's some sort of satirical element of just sticking a character into a strip that you immediately license, I think, was kind of amusing to him, and that it would have this weird life of its own. But yeah, I think that he Yeah, I just think babies are creepy. Let's fully admit it, and God bless those kids for having the good sense to think so. But no, I always found it amusing that Alice was like 4 years old and casting aspersions at a 15-month-old or 18-month-old or whatever the baby might be.
Mm-hmm.
The baby is a portent of doom, as they would say.
Yeah. There was another one
the
early
Baroque
on
language is pretty good.
where there were like twin babies in a stroller, and the last panel, I think it was Petey, was saying that their eyes were just staring at him or something.
Yeah, the dead eyes of it. I always like the way Petey kind of regards Alice's preschool the way that I regard the college that I left like 20 years earlier. Like, he gets like the misty-eyed nostalgia. Oh, I remember those days. I mean, it could have been like 2 years ago that Petey was there or whatever. Not that long ago. But he seems to remember it like the hallowed days at the playing fields of the boys' school in which he was raised, this goofy preschool. So yeah, I mean, kids are like that. Kids are obsessed with their own past. Kids want to know about their stuff, so kids have this definite sense of time, and that, you and I might find ridiculous being ancient old men to think that there's much difference between a 4-year-old and a 15-month-old. But I bet there's all the difference in the world back then when you're running around and making those distinctions yourself.
Yeah.
But they are creepy. Let's be honest.
And anytime anyone suggests any potential mayhem or tools for mayhem, it's like, where can I get that? Why isn't the world providing this for me? I don't know the name of the kid in Alice's preschool with the big eyebrows. I think it was Sammy.
Oh, I always forget. Yeah, that is
Sami.
Right.
Maybe he's from India.
Yeah,
I'm not sure, but he's saying that his hammer got taken away. And his mom had said to his dad, "A little boy with a hammer? Why not just give him a nail gun too?" And then there's a silent panel, and then Alice says, and he says, "That was last month. So far, nothing." The sarcasm was lost on him. It's just, well, where's my nail gun? Why can't I have a nail gun?
Yeah, I always thought I always liked the fact that he always leaves a lot of that stuff up to the imagination too. Like Bill's brothers, of course, are the big builders in the neighborhood, and there's a strip that I'm very fond of where Dill talks about when Alice was away at camp or away somewhere, and Dill spent every day over on her porch, and she thought that was kind of creepy. And he goes, "Well, my brothers were building, like this gun, and this was out of range of the gun, so that's why he was there." So there's always that, kind of. Not only do you see the kids sometimes planning and plotting and making these things, but you kind of see there's this kind of whole world of bustling activity right off panel. Mm-hmm. We never get to see Petey build the models that he makes, or the stuff for school, but they always just kind of show up. So I always like the fact that there's he has very industrious children in this neighborhood. The Cul de Sac is full of hardworking, young, inventive lads and lasses, and I appreciate that about them.
Mm-hmm. And very imaginative, always, and they're always coming up with new kind of legends of things. Like, what is it with the shopping carts?
Right.
The
herding
shopping carts.
They got very obsessed with the shopping carts, which gave us the payoff of there was a New Year's Day parade where they got one of the brothers is kind of the shopping cart herder, and at the local Big Mart or whatever, and so they all kind of obsess over this kind of them gathering together to be pushed, and when they get to be in a parade riding on top of the shopping carts, this is like one of the greatest moments of their lives. Yeah, I mean, he's really good at that. He's really good at those kind of casual, offhand, not overplaying those, I don't think. Not like he did a very funny Sunday that I don't think he ever went back to, which, you could probably get a month of strips out of, which was a giant pile of, like, plowed snow in a parking lot of a grocery store that he calls Mount Soot. Yeah. And talks about the monsters and the Mount Soot taking people away. And, yeah, he doesn't overplay that at all. Yeah, good for him. It's very, very judicious, he's a very, very confident cartoonist. Mm-hmm. I will say that. And never kind of thought that he was desperate to get a laugh.
It's interesting how, in some ways, the strip is completely realistic, and in other ways, he exaggerates things like that jungle gym. Every time we see that jungle gym, it's just this huge tangle of tubes and roofs and pipes, and I don't know what all. But every time he draws it that way, it must be a pain in the neck to draw. But or the dad's car, his little tiny car that he can hardly get in and out of. These kind of absurd elements in it.
The dad's car is what I think of as kind of like a classic kind of little item of fantasy that kind of gets slipped into an otherwise realistic strip. The grandmother's dog too. I don't know if you've ever seen any of those strips.
Yeah,
but
Big Shirley.
Big Shirley, which is very ridiculous looking, oversized dog, and the pictures of the grandmother, shouting, in traffic with it. So he does that very often. But like we said, it's very. He has a very restrained hand. He doesn't kind of go off. Mr. Danders, of course, is a fantasy figure, the guinea pig who talks and has adventures.
What a great name.
And that kind of thing too. So there is a little bit of that, but it never kind of overwhelms the strip. And I like the fact that he just kind of went ahead and did that he didn't second guess it or worry about that. I think that would have been my creative impulse would be, once you cross that line, you're never going back. But, he's kind of like, let's just, it just kind of naturally flows.
Mm-hmm.
You don't think, oh my gosh, all of a sudden, that guinea pig is talking.
Yeah.
Or that car is ridiculous.
It's amazing to me how funny the grandmother strips are.
Yeah, they are. We could do a whole, like Peppermint Patty, you could do a whole strip about the grandmother.
Yeah.
I was always fondest of Dill, I think, of all the characters. But I have a soft spot for like slightly confused, super naive innocents. I always think that they're the funniest characters of all, and I always thought that was a really nice one. I'm always fond of characters with ridiculous hair, of which Alice is one, and Dill, of course, is another.
Yeah, hair that always has gum in it.
Any kid that looks like has punishment hair, I think is a great thing.
Anything you want to plug?
Dude, anything I want to plug? That's a great thing. When is this going to run? I have no idea. I know that I hope that people will buy whatever I'm sure that all of Richard's stuff will be collected. That's one nice thing about the attention that he got right away from comic book people was that he had a lot of options when it came to collecting his work, and he was very comfortable working with Andrews McMeel, and they did a really nice job getting his work out there. So I'm sure that's with whom he'll go in the future. But I don't think they'll. I think we're going to get all of it. I think all of it will be in print in some form or another. And I think that's never going to be a problem for Richard's stuff. And that's good. I think that a lot of my favorite strips that did not last as long, that kind of went out for reasons that they never got over. I don't know that we'll ever see a Franklin Phibbs book or a James book, or some of the strips that didn't work out that I wish kind of had a book. So one great thing is that we'll have all of that strip in print. As far as my own crap, man, I got nothing. Are you kidding me? My crappy site. That's it. That's my engagement with comics.
Yeah, Comics Reporter.
My lousy site. We're going to struggle through the end of the year. A lot of weeping. A lot of complaining about things. A lot of doing absolutely no good. A lot of being ignored. A lot of angering people that used to be my friends.
I see.
You know how it is. It's a terrible thing. But next weekend I'm going to go to Small Press Expo, and Richard's getting a special Ignatz Award, and I'm going to accept it for him. He's already taped a thing, which he will come on in his tape thing and be much funnier than I'll ever be in my entire life. And
he must be hilarious in person.
Yeah, he is very funny. He told the funniest story that I ever got in an interview, which was, he told a story about, he was talking about the MS, and he talked about how one of the reasons he was glad when he finally got, not the MS, the Parkinson's,
yeah.
When he finally got his diagnosis, he was very glad because it actually explained some things that had been going on in his life beforehand. And I said, well, what kind of things were like that? He said, well, I had this dream. I had these really bizarre dreams. I had a dream that I went to the grocery store in my pajamas, and the crowd that was watching us kind of laughed a little bit. And he said, and I went in and I saw the shoe bomber there, and the crowd laughed a little bit more. And I'm like, oh, get him, there's the shoe bomber. So immediately, I run over and I start punching the shoe bomber. And so people are kind of laughing, and he goes, and then all of a sudden I wake up and I'm in my bed and I'm punching my 8-year-old. Like, nobody laughs. Like, the entire room just deflates. And he goes, oh, she was all right. And then he looks over at me and he goes, I got to stop telling that story. It was the funniest damn story that we just paints him in the most horrible light possible. This quiet, unassuming, nice man. And obviously he'd been telling the story a lot and getting the same reaction every time out. So that's what I remember, such a nice, kind of mild-mannered guy, but what a fearless cartoonist. If we can have fearless cartoonists, that was one. He really did the strip he wanted to do, and he really told the jokes he wanted to tell, and so good for him.
Cul de Sac collections by Richard Thompson are published by Andrews McMeel. Tom Spurgeon's site is comicsreporter.com. This is Tim in 2016. Hope you enjoyed the Flashback episode. Don't forget to check out our show notes and social media links at deconstructingcomics.com. Also, please stop by the site to take our listener survey. I've extended the deadline on it until September 16th. Next week, in a brand new episode, Kumar and Coom take on Alan Moore's run on the 90s Image Comics title Supreme. Till then, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.